The ayes have it, and the report will be received and staff will publish it. Thank you, Mr. D'Souza.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next, we have the Procure-to-Pay process audit report. Mr. Tetzel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Per our 2016 audit plan, I think we started out with an accounts payable audit, and then that evolved into a procure-to-pay audit as we noticed that there were controls that the procurement and accounts payable teams relied on upstream. So we felt like broadening the scope of this audit a little bit to make sure that we were capturing all the controls and addressing the risks here. There's still another piece of this whole puzzle, which is source to contract, that we didn't cover that will probably be covered in a future year. But the RFP process, contracting, that was not included here in Procure-to-Pay. So the objective was to assess the effectiveness of how the city records receipts of goods and services, invoices, and pays its vendors. We also wanted to determine whether or not ComEd, the GL system, adequately facilitated the process and met the needs of the users. The scope here was looking at any disbursements between January 1st, 2015 and March 31st, 2016. And the scope was looking at the vendor master file, which we'll talk about, requisition, purchase order and receiving process, payments to vendors by Treasury, and administrative access. Before we go into the findings, general commentary on Procure-to-Pay, it's a pretty good process. I think there's a little bit of room for improvement, but there's generally good awareness around risks within the Treasury and AP team. I think they understand what they need to do and how to do it. Again, there's a few rooms for improvements, but no red flags here. We didn't find any fraud, which is good news. So I'll run through these findings. The first finding was about vendor file maintenance. The vendor file is basically a list of all of the vendors that we've set up to be able to disperse to. When we're paying an invoice, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to pay whomever I want, right? It has to be someone that's set up in the system. We've hopefully validated their tax identification number. They've given us a W-9. There's a process there. We can't just pay anyone willy-nilly. There's a way to go about it. Because of that, it's important to have good controls around your vendor master file. Some of the problems that can come up, some of them are fraud. If someone can create a fake vendor or a duplicate vendor with the same name, maybe it's AT&T and it's AT ampersand T, but the and T they use to disperse to, and it goes to their bank account, right? They set something different up. Another is simply you make a mistake and you put in another vendor. I think Quest turned into CenturyLink, and maybe someone just put in CenturyLink because it wasn't there, and now we have Quest and CenturyLink, but they have the same tax identification number. When you have multiple vendors like that, some of the challenges you have are when you do have an update or when you do need to maintain that vendor file, sometimes you don't know that you need to go to find all the duplicates and maintain those too. And so if someone does end up paying one of those other ones, they might be paying it to an old bank account, the wrong lockbox address. It's inefficient. So what we found here in this audit was there were some unauthorized vendor file changes, there were some missing tax identification numbers, and there were some duplicate vendors. There is a way when changes are made to a vendor in Comet for someone to type in, what change they made and why. Because we don't have audit logging for all these changes. It would take up too much time on the system. But we found that there were some that didn't have any explanations. It looks like some of those were done by a vendor potentially. And then we were aware that you can go into a vendor's file, and if you just hit save to exit, it looks like you did something, right? It looks like something happened, but you can't tell what happened. And so someone might have gone in, and say, oh, I didn't really need to be here, or there's nothing to change, and hit save, and it looks like you updated the file, but we can't tell. And so there's a place to put some commentary. We noticed that there was commentary a good amount of times, so that was nice to see, but sometimes there wasn't. Tax identification numbers, we found some of those that were missing. There used to be a process where they would sample from the list of vendors and see if the tax identification number was there. Probably wasn't a well-designed control, because you could easily pull all the vendors out of the system, sort it by tax ID, and see the ones that were simply blank or duplicate. So there's an easier way to do that, and we're happy to help going forward. But there were missing tax identification numbers. We've historically been fined by the IRS in the past for having wrong tax ID numbers or missing tax ID numbers. So there's a reason why we should care about them. That fine is usually about 3 years in arrears, because it takes a while for them to do the audit, and then I think you have to have problems for 3 years before they start to fine you. So hopefully we'll see those go down, but it's a really easy fix if someone just goes in periodically and make sure that those are updated. Treasury was under the presumption that the TIN number, the tax ID number, was a required field when they set a vendor up. We found out that that wasn't the case, and so they've made it so that you have to put a tax identification number in, even if you put 11111, like you have to put something in there. So it's a start, but it doesn't fix everything. It's not a panacea for that. We still want them to validate that number with the IRS to make sure that, yes, this is the organization that we're working with. Like we're only supposed to be paying valid businesses, legitimate businesses. So that's why that comes into play. The duplicate vendors is just another area where we have a variety of duplicates, either in name, in tax identification number with different names, in supplier ID. When we create a vendor in PeopleSoft, it assigns them a supplier ID. So we've seen one vendor with multiple supplier IDs, multiple instances of that. We've seen different names with the same tax identification number all over the place. So there's cleanup is necessary there, but again, it doesn't seem like it's a problem of the magnitude that we can't handle. I think if they go in and clean this up and then figure out better controls over creating new vendors, and if those get reviewed, then we'll probably be in pretty good shape there. Any findings or any questions on finding number one?
I don't think so. Are there any comments or questions? I don't think so.
Okay. Madam Chair, I didn't interrupt. We were asking each other questions, but I don't know if you can answer this. We're curious, how many total vendors are there on the database?
What is it, 8,000? 21,000.
21,000, and we've identified 13 duplicates?
Yes, there's 8,000 active, yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. They're, yeah. So there's inactive vendors and there's active vendors. Once we don't pay someone for a certain amount of time, the system automatically deactivates a vendor, and then you can't make payments to them. We can't erase them, because if we need to go back and report on some of that information, we can do that this day. Yes, it seems like a small number, but if you think about the opportunities for fraud, we'd like it to be zero, and we can get there. I don't think it's impossible at all. The second finding is around timely payments. One, we have a sizable opportunity to pay vendors early to get a small discount on those invoices, and we've established some of those terms with a certain amount of vendors. We found that we took advantage of about 25% of those opportunities. So there's still a little room there. There's also some room, and our report includes a recommendation of potentially including this in our standard contract language. Why don't we ask everyone for early payment discounts? I don't think it's burdensome for vendors if we're talking about 2% and getting paid within 10 days rather than 30 or 40 or 50. Most people would probably want to sign up for that, and there's substantial savings to the city. If you think about our budget of 1.4 billion, a big chunk of that is payroll, but a lot of that is going to vendors. And if we could save a couple percent, that'd be great. We did notice, and I want to talk about the state auditor's finding on late payments. And we don't have a finding on that. We have more of an observation. We keep getting dinged by the state auditors for making payments later than the statutory requirements of 35 days. And we wanted to get a better understanding of why that's happening. It's not because of finance. In our sample, we did some analytical testing, and we noticed that there were payments that had gone out as quickly as 2 or 3 days. So they can pay stuff on time. When we talked to Treasury about it, they mentioned some of their struggles are getting the invoices approved from the department so they can release that payment, or even getting the invoice. Some invoices get sent to a representative in a department, and AP they have no idea that we have that obligation until someone approves that and gives it to them. We do have an email address where people can send in their invoices. It goes straight to procurement, or it's not procurement, AP, and then they can route it out for approval. Probably a much more efficient way to handle these, because then they can follow up, they can track this. I get emails frequently from the team saying, please approve this, and please approve this quickly. So they're good at what they do. And so what we did was we met with a few departments, a handful of departments, to understand what were some of their challenges in getting this approval back to AP so that we could pay it. And there were quite a few things, and they make sense, right? Some of them were we ran out of contract dollars and we needed to get into another contract. One of them was we had a contract, but other departments were using that same vendor, and those payments were getting applied to our contract. So out of the blue, we realized, gosh, that contract's up, but we didn't spend all of that money. It got spent by some other departments. So one of our recommendations is for the Treasury team to, in their conversations with these departments, and they meet with almost all departments, if not all of them, throughout the year to talk about late payments and other opportunities, and they do a good job of that. I think they should explore what are some of the upstream causes of them not being able to approve things timely. Honestly, there might be times when it's appropriate that we don't pay something timely, that we're just not comfortable with the information that we got, that it could be a variety of things, but there might be times where it's just not appropriate, and the city needs to be okay with that. So I don't expect us to ever get to that every single invoice gets paid within 35 days. I think that might be unreasonable in today's day and age, but I think we can do better. So we're going to encourage finance to figure out what some of those bottlenecks are, and then let's explore how we can fix those to make their jobs a little bit easier. But we did want to give you guys some clarity on the root cause of that, and being comfortable with that yes, we can pay timely, and yes, finance does do a good job when they have the information they need to release it. We can't pay something until it gets approved. With the government, the city is not supposed to pay unless we've received goods or services, and so you can imagine if we're doing a huge construction project, that's probably a really big invoice. It's probably a lot of work to approve that, and so. Personally, I'd be more comfortable with someone taking the time to make sure that they're going through that. If it takes a few more days than 35, then us just saying let's just pay it and then see later if it's accurate.
Thank you, Mr. Neal.
Mr. Tessel, is there some formal protocol in our system where we identify disputed payments, kind of what I think you were referring to, where we're not going to pay within that statutory time limit? But is there a way to flag that so that different people along the way know there's a disputed payment?
Chair Palmisano, Mr. Neal. Not formally, but informally. When we started asking the question of past state auditor findings on late payments and,
I think I meant disputed invoice, but go ahead.
Sure, but it kind of ties into that. Some of it was because, we might have gotten an invoice that was dated, say we got it on June 30th, that was dated April 1st. And it's just like, well, no, it's already late, right? Like, according to how we transact and how we record that information, it's already late. And so there's times when we need to push back. And so I think what we're trying to do and working with the state auditors on that is say, what's that 35 days based on a sort of a more clean invoice, right? So one that we haven't disputed any charges with, one that if they just sent it to us really late, perhaps we could record when we actually received it. So maybe a little bit more flexibility there. And Treasury has been working with the state auditors on some of those to get those off the list of ones that they discover in their audit. And I think there was a few this year where they said, it looks like this is really late, but there might be something wrong with the invoice. Some of the information might not be accurate. We might have received it later than, the standard, a few days in the mail after their invoice date, something like that. So it's informal, but I think the state understands it and they've been flexible there. Thank you.
Mr. Tetzel, my understanding is by state law, the city can be penalized for late payments by vendors, like a 1.5% or something. How does that get applied in a situation like you just mentioned? If it's basically a backdated or was an invoice that didn't get sent to the city for a couple of months?
Madam Chair, we don't voluntarily pay that. I think a vendor has the right to sort of penalize us for late payments. It's pretty rare, and at times we've been able to talk through that and get that reversed. But it happens. It's one more reason for us to care about getting payments done timely. But I think the city's done well in negotiating some of those, some of the larger ones, from what we understand, away from vendors. But it's that sort of that dark cloud that looms over timely payments, right? There's a financial reason why we should care about it. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's that potential opportunity to save a couple percent if we pay even quicker.
Yeah, this was the finding I was most excited about. Actually, it seems to be a real opportunity. And yeah, it is also a difficult problem to solve. To kind of get back to an earlier point that Mr. Fisher made, this is really decentralized and we need to find a way to hold each department accountable, because AP, accounts payable, is doing the right thing. Treasury is really speedy. We need to have some of these other things in order, and I understand that Mr. Ruff, appreciates that and has responded accordingly, and has some thoughts in mind about how they might help as Treasury meets with all the departments over the course of the year. So, thanks.
The third finding is around segregation of duties, which Nikhil touched on earlier. And I'd like to highlight how we approached it. There exists an access review at the city. And correct me if I'm wrong, Nikhil, but I think the way that we were doing it was to say, let's pick a role, and we'll go through all the roles, but let's pick a role and see who has access to that role and if that's appropriate. And the way that Backbone did it was to say, let's pick a person and see all the roles that they have, because some of them might be conflicting, right? You might be able to approve your own transactions. You might be able to create ghost employees and then give them loads of vacation that end up going to your house. So there's a couple ways to look at access, and I think that finance realizes the value in looking at the way that we approached it. And that's how we discovered these segregation of duties issues here. It's by person, not by role. You won't find them by role. Typically, you'll find, Bob doesn't work in payroll anymore, so he shouldn't have this payroll role, but you won't find conflicting roles that one person has in an organization unless you look at everyone and all the roles that they have. There were a few general recommendations that came out of this audit that weren't really strong enough to be findings, but we felt like they were important enough to be discussion topics here and with the finance team. The first one, closing out blanket POs at year end. So currently, departments are inappropriately using these blanket purchase orders. So with a blanket purchase order, you can say, I'm going to spend, I want to pre-approve, this X dollars worth of spend over this period of time. So every time we get an invoice from this organization, we don't have to go through this PO requisition, It streamlines it a bit. But typically when you do that, you want to only do it within a fiscal period, a fiscal year. Otherwise, it starts to confuse some of the budgeting numbers when you go into future years and you're charging against a PO from a year prior, or sometimes I think departments can use it to sort of like, if there's a contract in place, block all this money in a protective sort of way. But it doesn't really help them that much administratively. It saves them a little time, but it causes a lot of confusion. And it's basically what it's done to finance is makes a lot of information basically unusable to them. So if we dealt with POs in a way that I think finance intends to, and they're drafting policies, that information they can get out of the system for budgeting purposes will be much more meaningful, and we can get people to stop doing this in order to cut out some administrative time down the road when it comes to requisitions and purchase orders when they get invoices. The second one was around three-way match and exception reporting. The three-way match process is helpful because it will tie the PO to the invoice to any, if we have a receiving slip or an approval. The way that Comet works now is that they'll run a report that will do this match, and any exceptions will kick out. And if there's no exceptions, a report won't generate. And so that worries me a little bit, because I would always go back to the thought of, is the report working, or is there really no match exceptions? And so there's a couple opportunities there that we're having discussions with. Some of them aren't easy fixes, right? We don't want to tell them to go fix Comet, because that can be a very time-consuming and costly way to do things. But if there's another way to get around some of this uncertainty with this three-way match process, then I think it would be helpful. The last topic on the general recommendations is around invoice approvals. In my experience, a lot of organizations, maybe not a lot, but organizations make a decision whether or not to assign levels or delegate approval authority to spend money. So if you're this level in the organization, you can approve invoices and spending up to this amount. There isn't such a determination, nor I think was there ever a formal decision that we're not interested in doing that. Here at the city, we'd encourage finance to explore whether or not they think that would be a good idea, and if so, what those levels might be. Some organizations, it's if you're spending over $2 million, someone else needs to sort of get in on that decision. But is there some threshold where they think not anyone and everyone could approve this spend, and how do we do that? Again, this isn't something that this isn't a finding. It's just a recommendation of explore this, and we'll talk about it later. That's the end of the ProcuretoPay audit. Any questions there?
Mr. Tetzel, a kind of a general comment that I didn't fully appreciate till I read through this audit report. It seems like technology has moved forward, and maybe there's some reason, maybe there's some state law that prevents us from doing so, but it seems like finance gets kind of stuck almost going backwards in their work to do requisitions and then purchase orders. That seems a bit like trying to use two systems at the same time. One was the old checks and balances, and one is the current modern financial systems. Are there opportunities here, or are there state laws that we're trying to adhere to, and that's why we have this? Even if we need to go backwards through our processes, we go back and create a requisition and then a purchase order to tie it out. I'm just curious how that works here.
Madam Chair, it's a good question. I can tell you my perspective, and because we're such a small department that we don't have the staff that would do some requisition processing, right? So the first step is to create a requisition and get that approved to say I'm intending on spending some money, and then that would create a purchase order, which gives you that permission to spend money. One, we don't buy a lot of goods. That's typically kind of a purchasing goods sort of mentality. We don't buy many goods; it's typically services. And so, from our perspective, it's we'll pay for a training, I'll get an invoice, and I'll send it in. Behind the scenes, someone has to go back and create a requisition, and that gets approved by someone in the coordinator's office, and then that creates a PO. So there's all of this sort of like old school stuff that happens, pardon the colloquy, to be able to process that transaction. I don't know how appropriate that is, or if that's just antiquated or not. I think it makes sense in some ways. It's probably a better question for someone in finance, maybe even specifically the treasurer or controller's office, to understand if we're really not doing this whole requisition, PO, spend the money, invoice, three-way match type of thing. How much of that is necessary? It's a good question. But the horse gets put before the cart sometimes, because that's how some of the departments are set up, or that's how we transact. The P card will solve some of those problems, and finance is working on rolling out the P card program sort of more enterprise-wide. That circumvents a lot of those steps. Basically, when someone's given a credit card with a credit limit, it's almost like giving them a purchase order to spend a certain amount of money, right? You're just not saying for this vendor, for this product at this time. And so that'll handle some of these. But again, if we have a contract in place, we're not supposed to use the P card to purchase against that contract. So it's a good question for finance. I don't know if there's a way to streamline the process or not. But.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? I will follow up with that with finance offline. Okay. Great. May I have you're through, right, Mr. Tetzel? May I have a motion to receive this report and direct staff to publish it?
So moved.
Second. Great. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and this report will be received and staff will publish it. I'll do some of those more informal follow-up questions offline. But finally, Mr. Tetzel, you've prepared an update for the committee on some of the other ongoing work of your department. Mr. Tetzel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So here's a snapshot of our audit plan and projects update. You'll notice there are 2 projects that we have not started yet. Currently, we are working on license plate reader readiness, police records management implementation, MPD third-party audit, and the Park and Recreation Board worker safety audits. 2 that we haven't started are civil rights contract compliance and the police body camera pre-requirement review. The body camera will probably be pushed off until at least next year. The audit requirements for that aren't due. The formal audit of that for the state isn't due until 2018. So I do that next year. There was one project that fell off the plan, and that was the ELMS consultation. So IT had asked us before if we'd, for the potential to consult on some of the modules of the ELMS system, but I don't think they needed the help. So we took that one off the plan. It was only 40 hours there, so it wasn't a big chunk of time. To give you a quick update on license plate reader, the city has several devices that monitor license plates on vehicles throughout the city. The state came up with some legislation this year or last recently on required biannual audits of those readers and how we store that information. So we've been working with the police department and IT on getting a sense of, do we need to improve anything or change anything to meet these requirements? And then once we move out of that and into the area where we're ready for a formal audit, we'll determine whether or not it's appropriate for the audit department to do that or to have that outsourced. The state did come up with a checklist that sort of helps you interpret the legislation, and we got that after we had sort of made our audit plan, and it validated that the things that we're looking at were appropriate. You want to be careful not to look at too much, because there might be something that has an opportunity to be improved, but it might not be something that's mandated by the state. So we're very cautious of that.
Commissioner Tapp.
Thank you, Chair. Is the park board included in this one?
Do you have license plate readers? I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
I don't know. I don't really quite understand exactly what this does.
I'll look into it.
Okay, thanks.
From Madam Chair, and Commissioner Tabb, from what I understand, these are mechanisms that the city, cameras that the city places in areas of high traffic or concern. I don't think they're in all of the squad cars. I think that's maybe potentially different.
Madam Chair.
We'll check with Park and Rec.
Mr. Neal?
Thanks.
Mr. Tetzel, this is primarily, though, an audit of whether they're retaining the data for the statutory amount of time and then disposing of it, right? Those are the key metrics?
Madam Chair, Mr. Neal. Yes, there's a few more things. It's administrative, right? The people that have access to the system, how long we store the information. We do share some of this information with other municipalities. So are we including the state language on the classification of this, and that they need to follow these classification standards and retention standards? But yes, it's very administrative.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Okay.
We have a couple slides on state auditor findings updates for both the city and another slide for Park and Rec. As you can see here, we have some pretty reasonable due dates, and a couple items have been corrected, which you expect. Audit adjustments are corrected before the report even goes out. Prior period adjustments, same thing. But it seems like finance is on track to handle those appropriately, as is the Park and Rec department. They have a little bit fewer, but again, this is just corroborated information that we're communicating to you. We do not go in and validate the appropriateness of our responses and whether or not they're remediated. It's just information communicated from these departments to you guys since you've received the report. And then audit findings follow-up. As you know, not following up on audit findings would sort of diminish the value of any work that we do. So we think it's very important to follow up on these findings, and as we move on into future years, this will become a larger and larger body of work. So this is a listing of all of the audits and how many findings there were, how many have been resolved, how many are outstanding, and a range of due dates or a due date that we have been communicated to that these will be remediated. With findings follow-up, we will do more formal procedures on a sort of short, abbreviated way to evaluate this, like we had done in an audit. So if we did a sample of 30 in an audit for something and found something, we might do a sample of 5 and see that these controls that people have put in place or departments are working effectively. And so as we get through some of the rows in this, then we'll report out to you the results of those, but rather do it per audit and per finding. So there hasn't been a single audit that all of the findings have been remediated as of yet. There is one audit, the CPED loan audit that we issued last time. They're still working on their remediation plan, and so we should have that information by the November meeting. We hope to.
Thank you.
That's all.
I find this especially helpful to help us see where that work goes and how it gets considered and how we track it over time. Thank you for putting together that update. Are there any questions or comments from the committee on that? Okay. May I have a motion to receive and file the update from our internal auditor?
Second.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and the reports will be received and filed. Are there any announcements? I don't have any myself. Okay. With that, colleagues, we've completed all the items on our agenda. Seeing no further business to be presented, this meeting is adjourned.